Well, hello, this is number 6, the last of the Old Testament characters who find themselves locked up or imprisoned in some form or another. And of course, we have to look at Daniel and the marvelous, extraordinary 6th chapter of Daniel. When in the 5th century, the Western Empire of Rome, the Eastern Empire would last for another 1,000 years, but the Western Empire was collapsing, and Augustine, the great Saint Augustine, was trying to come to terms with the shift in culture. The empire, of course, had become Christian under Constantine, and now it was facing collapse, unable to contain its borders with the Gauls and Britain to what we would now call the Spanish border and so on. Augustine wrote his famous book, The City of God, in which he reminded himself and reminded his readers in a way that is most compelling even today as we live our lives in shifting cultures, that the city that will remain is the city that is above and not the city that is below. And perhaps you and I both feel that we are living in a hostile culture, a culture that is hostile to Christianity, to the Judeo-Christian substrata that our society was built on. And the difficulty of maintaining a consistent and faithful witness when life seems to be upended. And that's the context of Daniel chapter 6. He is being asked to demonstrate faithfulness and courage in a moment of imprisonment when his life is now in danger. And Daniel was a teenager back in 587 when Jerusalem collapsed to the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar and was transported to Babylon. We are now on the other side of the exile, 537, and we're in the reign of Cyrus and Darius. I say Darius, some people say Darius. So we're in the 530s or the late 520s BC. In other words, Daniel is now at least in his 80s. He might be around 85 or so in the events that take place in Daniel chapter 6. What I want us to see is just how Daniel thrives even in the midst of the hostility that is being shown towards him and his religion. It's a cultural war that is being engaged in. Daniel has emerged out of the exile as one now who probably spoke a different language. He had a different name. But he is still, of course, a prophet of the Lord and still maintains that vigor about his faith. And he's risen to a political hierarchy. Subordinates are jealous of him and they are challenging him. That's the context of Daniel chapter 6. And I want us to see several things here. First of all, let's look a little more closely at the opposition. Like Joseph in Egypt, Daniel has been placed in an important position. He'd given himself to serve his society as Joseph in Egypt had given himself to serve in the society that he was put in. He understood, do you see, Joseph and Daniel both understood that wherever you are, no matter how hostile the culture, and Daniel is now in a Persian culture. He's been in his own Judaistic culture. He's been in a Babylonian culture. Now he's in a Persian culture, which is very different. And yet another different language. But Daniel sees that his vocation in life, even as a prophet, is to serve that culture, to better that culture, to be salt and light in that culture. He didn't view his earthly calling as subordinate to his true calling as a prophet. He saw both of these callings to go hand in hand. If you're a Christian and a lawyer, then be a Christian as a lawyer. If you're a Christian and a businessman, be a Christian as a businessman. If you're a Christian and a doctor, be a Christian doctor. There's a doctrine of vocation here, as there is in the narrative of Joseph. And the doctrine of vocation was huge in the Reformation. It was something that Luther and Calvin, Luther especially, wrote a great deal about the doctrine of vocatio, of vocation. And Daniel's subordinates are jealous. Daniel is doing a good job. He's doing a great job. And his subordinates are jealous, and they set up a trap. It's a masterpiece of political intrigue and deception. Verse 6 of chapter 6, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And these Persian monarchs, Cyrus, Darius, others, viewed themselves as gods, as incarnations of God, and therefore to be worshipped and adored. And it was a masterpiece, of course. It was a piece of political genius to attack Daniel, not at the level of his weakness, but at the level of his greatness. The fact that they knew that Daniel would not be able to comply to this injunction. Such was Daniel's testimony in this foreign, hostile culture to his faith, that his subordinates knew that compromise wasn't possible for Daniel. That's amazing. And it's challenging. And I wonder if that could be said of us. Would non-Christian folk say of us in the workplace, that person, no matter what laws are going to be implemented in this company, that person is never going to compromise. Secondly, the obedience. The obedience. And you see that in verses 10 through 18 of chapter 6. And there's a shift of scene. And if this were a movie, you'd immediately realize that this is no longer out of doors, but indoors. And it's in Daniel's home. And he hears of the king's decree. And his response is to go upstairs and to open the windows and to pray to Yahweh, facing Jerusalem, as he had always done. And this is a little in contrast now to Jeremiah. Jeremiah went indoors and vented and said, woe is me, and I wish I'd never been born, and so on. And we saw the positive and negative sides of that in our previous study together, but there's none of that in Daniel. Daniel is a different character, just like you and I are different characters, and we have different dispositions, and he doesn't question God's will, and he doesn't get angry, and he doesn't engage in a great deal of soul searching, and he doesn't try to find some clever philosophical explanation worthy of Thomas Aquinas as to why he shouldn't have to obey this injunction right now, or to compromise with this injunction right now. Daniel is absolutely clear what he must do. He must obey God rather than men, as we shall see with Peter and John in the Acts of the Apostles, when they are told not to preach anymore in the name of Jesus. It is perfectly clear. This is not a philosophical moment. This is not a moment to find some get-out clause and hire a lawyer to say, this is the reason why you can compromise here. It was clear to Daniel what he must do. He must do what he always did and pray 3 times a day. And perhaps an echo of Psalm 55 and verse 17, morning, evening, and noon. Morning, evening, and noon. He had a routine. That's what this says. This wasn't something new. He wasn't introducing it just to make a point. He was doing what he always did. It was a pattern. Just like Nehemiah. When Nehemiah was serving the Persian prince, and Nehemiah comes just 30 years or so, 40 years or so after Daniel, the next generation. And when he is serving, he's the cupbearer to King Ahasuerus, the Persian king. And he comes in looking a little gloomy because he's had bad news from a brother, maybe his literal brother in Jerusalem. Things are not going well there. And he's 1,000 miles away. And he's looking sad. And it wasn't for him to look sad. He was the one who tasted the wine to make sure there wasn't any poison in it. And looking sad was definitely not part of that. It was looking happy that was part of that. And the king asks him, what's wrong? And he has a moment to answer. And we read that he prayed to the Lord. It's one of those arrow-like prayers. It's just like, Lord, help me, because that's all the time he had. But it was instinctive. It was instinctive. It was built into his routine. And the reason why we find Nehemiah praying long, lengthy prayers in the book of Nehemiah is because he had a habit and an instinct of prayer. And that's true, I think, of Daniel. Spies were sent to his home. And you read that in verses 12 and 15. And they report this to the king. And in verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. It's a trap. And Daniel's obedience has caused him to fall into this trap. And the king, who clearly liked Daniel, the king had an order. And there's an issue in Daniel 6 about Darius the Mede and who is Darius the Mede. And there are books and articles because we really don't know who Darius the Mede was. And is Darius the Mede another name for Cyrus, or is he a co-leader with Cyrus? And there are lots of possibilities here. But there is certainly a decree that the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be broken. And once this law had been enacted that no one should pray but to King Darius for 30 days. Once that decree had been established, it could not be broken, and Darius has no choice now but to find him guilty and to send him to the lion's den. His opposition, his obedience, his deliverance. And we read in verses 19 through 24, it's dawn. And Darius goes to the lion's den. That's unusual. Somebody of Darius's power, and he was a powerful, powerful man, given to bloodthirsty brutality in war, especially. And his famous wars against the Greeks, for example, the Battle of Thermopylae, for example. And tens of thousands of people were killed in some of these battles, and in a terrible way. But here's this tender moment, the other side of Darius, and he could have just sent messengers. But he comes, perhaps because he knew that there was a possibility. He'd seen Daniel's faith. He'd seen Daniel's courage. He'd seen his commitment. And perhaps now it was curiosity and maybe something more, that he actually comes to the lion's den. And there he is, Daniel, not a scratch. Lions sleeping, snoring. Not a scratch. The lions aren't even hungry. And what is the explanation? It is the supernatural. It is God. It is the presence of God. Daniel was saved because during that evening, when all the angels of heaven gathered together to receive their night orders, one of them was given this extraordinary command: go to Babylon. There, my beloved servant Daniel is to be thrown into a den of lions. Keep the mouth of every lion closed. And the angel came at the speed of divinity and did God's bidding. That's the reason. Sinclair Ferguson reminds us in his commentary on Daniel, wonderful commentary that it is, reminds us of the story of John Newton, a familiar story to all of us, the author of Amazing Grace. March the 21st in 1748, he was aboard that ship called the Greyhound, and by then he was a seasoned sailor, but a terrible storm whipped up at sea, and it was threatening to break the ship, these wooden ships, apart, and he was asleep in his cabin, and a large sort of burst of water came through and woke him up, and he spent the whole night furiously pumping this water out of the ship, and some of the lives of his fellow sailors were lost, but he managed to survive. And in the midst of the storm, he cried out this simple prayer: Lord, have mercy. And he was struck by his own words. He had little or no time for God, and he cared nothing for mercy. But as Newton would later say in one of his hymns, sovereign grace has power alone to subdue a heart of stone. And the moment grace is felt, then the hardest heart will melt. Daniel was delivered by an act of supernatural grace. And then finally his triumph, because an extraordinary thing happens here. Darius issues another decree that promotes Daniel's God, that promotes Yahweh in the Persian Empire, throughout the empire. King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth. Verse 25. And this was the magnitude of the Persian Empire, or at least the arrogance of the Persian Empire, that they thought they governed the entire world. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Was he a believer? Did he get saved? Was he converted? Perhaps. Wouldn't it be great to think that he was? This ignoble monster of a man. And that God would rescue him, God would save him. Like Constantine, perhaps, in the Roman Empire. Great powers in the world today threaten the very life and existence of the church. And Christians scrabble and worry and write all kinds of things in Twitter and Facebook and who knows what. And God could change superpowers in an instant. In an instant. A great work was done through the obedience of one man in a prison, facing the mouths of lions. What it says, among other things, is the courage that Daniel had. That's the quality, I think, that emerges here. Courage. Courage to act on one's convictions. W.G.T. Shedd, theologian, 19th century, New York. Ships are safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. Mark Twain, no friend of Christianity, but he wrote, courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not the absence of it. Resistance to fear and mastery of fear. As God told Joshua in Joshua chapter 1, be courageous. Be courageous. Well, those are 6 Old Testament characters, all of them who faced a period of incarceration in some form or another and learned some valuable, valuable lessons in the midst of it. And you and I can learn some of those lessons today as we find ourselves, maybe not in a real prison, though maybe, but in imaginary prisons in the culture that we live in. And may God help us to be courageous like Daniel.